For centuries, the Western world has positioned itself as the beacon of progress, civilization, and morality. Through its dominance in global media, academia, and culture, the West has perpetuated a narrative of unparalleled enlightenment. Its democratic institutions, technological advancements, and cultural products are celebrated as the pinnacle of human achievement. This self-congratulatory narrative not only masks the West's history of exploitation, but also enables it to critique and dominate other regions while ignoring its contradictions. The truth, however, is far more complex and inconvenient. The West's rise was not built on moral or intellectual superiority, but on centuries of colonial violence, resource extraction, and the erasure of non-Western contributions. Beneath its facade of progress lies a legacy of slavery, systemic inequality, and cultural imperialism. Even today, the West employs a rhetoric of democracy and human rights to mask its failures and justify geopolitical interventions. This essay will deconstruct the myth of Western superiority by delving into its historical context, democratic contradictions, cultural hypocrisies, and manipulative narratives. By juxtaposing these realities against the achievements and philosophies of Asian civilizations, this essay challenges the outdated perception of the West as a moral and cultural guidepost. Long before Europe emerged as a global power, Asia thrived as a hub of innovation, governance, and culture. Ancient India, for example, was the birthplace of groundbreaking mathematical concepts like the concept of zero and algebra. Indian philosophers developed advanced theories of metaphysics and ethics, while its medical systems, such as Ayurveda, rivaled modern science in complexity and efficacy. Similarly, China was a world leader in technology and governance. The invention of gunpowder, the compass, and papermaking revolutionized human progress and enabled European exploration centuries later. China's Confucian system emphasized meritocracy, ethical governance, and societal harmony, providing a stable foundation for millennia. Meanwhile, the Middle East, during its Islamic Golden Age, produced significant advancements in astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Thinkers like Avicenna and Alhazen laid the groundwork for modern science, yet their contributions are often overshadowed by the Eurocentric lens of history. In stark contrast, medieval Europe was plagued by feudalism, widespread illiteracy, and a lack of basic hygiene. Cities were cesspools of disease, and the intellectual climate was stifled by religious dogma. Ironically, it was through contact with Asia and the Islamic world, via the Crusades and trade routes, that Europe eventually began to emerge from the Dark Ages. The West's ascendancy did not emerge from innovation but from ruthless exploitation. Colonial powers like Britain, Spain, and Portugal systematically plundered wealth from Asia, Africa, and the Americas. India, once a global economic powerhouse accounting for over a quarter of the world's GDP, was reduced to poverty by British policies such as deindustrialization and exorbitant taxation. In Latin America, the Spanish Empire extracted vast quantities of gold and silver, enslaving indigenous populations in the process. Similarly, the transatlantic slave trade orchestrated by European nations dehumanized millions of Africans and enriched Western economies. These atrocities were justified through racial superiority narratives, setting the stage for centuries of systemic inequality. Colonialism extended beyond material theft to the realm of ideas. European scholars appropriated knowledge from Asian and African cultures, often erasing their origins. Algebra, for instance, was developed by Middle Eastern mathematicians but is often credited to European thinkers like Fibonacci. The same pattern is evident in medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. This deliberate rewriting of history perpetuates the myth of Western intellectual superiority, obscuring the foundational contributions of other civilizations. Western democracies are often hailed as the gold standard of governance, but their flaws are glaring. The rise of populist leaders like Donald Trump in the United States or far-right movements in Europe exposes the fragility of these systems. Democracies often empower demagogues who exploit divisions, leading to polarization and stagnation. Additionally, systemic inequality persists in Western nations. Economic elites wield disproportionate power, while marginalized communities, particularly immigrants and ethnic minorities, are left behind. For instance, African Americans in the United States face systemic discrimination in housing, education, and law enforcement, despite the country's claims of equality. Many Asian nations offer alternative governance models that prioritize long-term development over short-term populism. China's meritocratic system has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty and positioned it as a global economic leader. Singapore, under technocratic leadership, transformed from a struggling post-colonial state into a thriving global hub. These systems emphasize stability, pragmatism, and collective well-being, contrasting sharply with the chaotic politics of Western democracies. The West has often used democracy as a pretext for intervention. The Iraq War, justified as a mission to spread democracy, led to mass casualties and regional destabilization. Simultaneously, the West has supported authoritarian regimes such as Saudi Arabia when it served its interests, revealing the hypocrisy of its democratic rhetoric. Western societies often critique Asian cultures as regressive while normalizing behaviors that undermine societal cohesion. The glorification of excessive alcohol consumption, drug use, and individualism has led to addiction crises, fragmented families, and social alienation. In contrast, many Asian cultures emphasize respect for elders, communal values, and self-discipline. Immigrants, particularly from Asia, are critical to sustaining Western economies. They excel in high-skilled professions from medicine to technology, yet face systemic racism and xenophobia. For example, the model minority stereotype in the United States both pressures Asian Americans to overperform and erases the discrimination they face. The West has a history of manufacturing threats to justify intervention. During the Cold War, the United States armed extremist groups like the Taliban to counter Soviet influence. Today, these same groups are portrayed as existential threats, illustrating the cyclical nature of Western foreign policy. Western media shapes global perceptions by amplifying negative stories about Asia and Africa while downplaying its own failures. Similarly, Western academic institutions often marginalize non-Western perspectives, perpetuating a Eurocentric worldview. Western nations face declining birth rates, aging populations, and uncompetitive industries. Meanwhile, China and India are rapidly growing as economic and military powers, challenging Western dominance. Individualism and consumerism have eroded traditional values in the West, leading to rising polarization and societal dysfunction. The myth of Western superiority is unraveling as its historical and contemporary contradictions come to light. As Asia rises, the world must reassess its perceptions and recognize the West's decline. The future demands a more balanced understanding of global contributions, free from the distortions of Western narratives.